Welcome to the Live Like It's True podcast. I'm Shannon Popkin. I'm an author, a speaker, and a Bible teacher. And here on the show, I'm inviting you to drink deeply of the true story of the Bible and live like it's true. God chose to reveal himself through a book filled with interesting, astonishing, true stories, which collectively tell the story of him. I like to think of each story in the Bible as a container for truth. Once you know the story, you can easily pull it down from the shelf of your mind, rehearse the truth, and share it with a friend. So I hope that this episode will inspire you to better know the story, share the story, and live like it's true. Gabe Hartfield, welcome back to Live Like It's True.
Hey, good to be with you.
Thank you so much for returning. Last time we were talking about literature of the Bible, story in the Bible, how God uses story to communicate with us. And now we're going to turn the conversation and talk about how we as communicators can use story for the sake of our audiences. I'm so excited about this conversation. Let me just introduce you to our audience, though. Gabe Hartfield, you've been the young adults pastor at Crossroads Bible Church, my church, for the past 3 years. My daughter has been in your group, which she and her friend Gabby, I hope it's okay for me to say, Lindsay and Gabby, kind of shortened the name. It used to be Post-College Young Adults, and they shortened it. Their claim to fame is they shortened it to the Post, and that just kind of took, right?
Yep. No, that I wasn't sure who was the one who came up with it. I think it was very good that somebody figured out a shortened version.
A shortened way. Well, and I love that our church has two groups. You know, we have the Walk, which is college students or college aged, and then the Post. Because there's just these transitions happening at that stage of life.
I also find that there's a lot of people that are out of college that are seeking community in that way. So yeah. No, and it's been so great to have you on staff at Crossroads. Okay, these guys love you. Your group, they just absolutely love you. I remember when I was just asking some of our young adults, hey, I led this group called Teach Equip, a group of women, training them to teach the Bible. And so I had asked we had several young adult women in the group and asked my daughter, asked around, and everybody was saying, you got to have Gabe come as a guest teacher for the Teach Equip group. And we did, and we loved having you there. So you are a seminary grad also from the Grand Rapids Theological Seminary. We were swapping stories about my friend Mike Whitmer was one of your professors. Mike has been a guest here on the podcast too. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. And you're looking forward to where God's going to lead you next. We're not sure.
Yep. Yeah, because I had a residency here at Crossroads and got an extension till this December. But I'm looking for what's next, if that's working at a church here in Grand Rapids or what. So yeah, just looking to figure that out and sense God's leading.
Well, this is just your thing. You love communication and, to not just craft a sermon that is precise and has all of the elements or whatever, but sermons that actually move people, impact people, right? Is that kind of the passion behind all of the work that you've done?
Yeah, I learned very early on that stories can have different functions. So I had two great storytellers in my life. There was my dad and my grandpa, and they both told stories, but for different reasons. So if my dad told a story, it always had a point to it. Like if there was something going on, like if we were misbehaving or if we were doing something, a story would come out and he'd tell us and we'd realize, oh, he's telling us something. Like there's something behind this story. My grandpa, on the other hand, whenever he told the story, there was virtually no point except to get people to laugh. And I also realized that's a function that there's. It's very disarming and it makes you very approachable. And so stories can have different functions. And so thinking about when we're preaching, like what is the function of this story that I'm telling?
Yeah, that's good. When my son was little, Cade, I'm talking about, he was just super naughty. And so I started coming up with these Sammy stories. And Sammy had an older brother and an older sister, and he would do some of the same naughty things that Kate had done. And I mean, anytime I would tell a Sammy story, he would just like be mesmerized, like, oh, and I was like your dad, I definitely had a teaching mindset as I'm telling this story. I want him to, there's something about stories that help us. They're not as in your face. Jesus often used stories that way. They're not as provocative or as maybe argumentative or confrontational. Stories allow us to look at something from a different angle, right?
Exactly, because it allows you to enter in and feel what the characters might be feeling, or see the like a comparable situation to your own, something that's like very similar to your own situation, but from a different perspective.
In my conversation with Amy DiMarcangelo, when we were talking about the Good Samaritan, it's the story where somebody's asking Jesus, who's my neighbor? Let's draw the boundary line so that I can make sure I'm doing what's expected of me, right? I want to know exactly where the perimeter is. And instead of answering that, Jesus tells a story about this man bleeding on the side of the road. And in a sense, he turns the table and who do you want to be your neighbor in that situation? When you're the one bleeding, like now, how are you going to answer that question? Now, he doesn't say that. He doesn't say, like, picture yourself bleeding on the road. He just tells a story about a man who's bleeding. But the people who are listening to the story are definitely going to identify with this man and be shocked that it's the Samaritan who comes to help them. Now who you like the fact that the Samaritan is your neighbor because you're bleeding and the priest just walked by and didn't help you. The Levite did nothing. So yeah, a story helps us to feel something, experience something, use our imaginations, enter in. And we as communicators, we can learn from Jesus, right? And his method of using stories.
I actually really love that example because you're right. If Jesus would have just said, you're wrong, you're asking the wrong question, you need to ask, like, how would you want to be treated? Or like,
Yeah.
what, like if you were in this situation, and if he just flat out said that, all the defense shields would have come up.
Right.
But instead, he offers a story that's very approachable, and seems like the person can explore this in their imagination. And then it's like a bomb detonates when you realize, oh, I can see how this story connects to the question I asked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, I like that idea of all the defenses
Mm-hmm.
are just silenced. You're not operating from a defensive demeanor or position. You're just receiving a story you can receive. And like, I'm thinking also of David with Nathan, who came to talk to him about his affair, right?
Yeah.
If he had marched in and said, look here, David may have been tempted to be defensive because he definitely had a hard heart at that point.
Yeah, because he gets David to say this is what he would do, or what the judgment would be for this man who did this thing, and then Nathan says, "You are that man."
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, like you can, as you're reading it, you can feel the conviction.
You are the man, which is such a storytelling way to tell this,
Yeah, yeah, because in that day and age, if you said something up against the king, you could be killed for it.
Oh,
There's plenty of examples of that. But Nathan is very tactful in his approach and is able to make a point without making an enemy. Like he's able to tell a story that allows David to like look in a mirror and see himself, as opposed to being the one who's just in your face confronting. Because we've all had those times where we thought we had more relational capital with someone than we actually did, and so we said something very just invasive in their personal life, and then all of a sudden all the defenses came up and we no longer have any relational capital in their life. It broke a bridge, it broke trust, versus saying a story that allowed them to come to their own conclusion.
That's actually, I think of stories as a way of bridging the gap, wanting to be a truth teller in somebody else's life. And I like, you kind of slipped a little sticky statement in there, Gabe, to make a point, not an enemy, right? To make,
Yeah.
he made a point He didn't make an enemy. And we can make a point using stories. That's one of the things that I continually call us back to on this podcast. Usually in our typical episodes, we'll talk through a story of the Bible, and then we'll talk about how does this story correct some of the false narratives of the world. And so, like, if you are walking with somebody who is believing one of these false narratives, and you want to get truth, you want it to land, you want to find an entry point to talk to them, but you're miles apart in your thinking and your living, and there's just such potential for the person to be defensive and to back away from you. And whether you do or don't have the relational capital, I think sometimes when you have the relational capital, there can be even more tendency for the person to react heavily because, like, how dare you talk to me like that? You might say that to your mom. You wouldn't say that to a stranger, right? But a story can help give you some common ground to talk about. Like, have you ever thought about the story of Noah and the flood?
Yeah.
Or have you ever thought about the story of Rahab? Or have you ever thought about the story of Jonah? And then maybe you share, like, remember in the story, I don't know what kind of point you might be wanting to make, but stories give you a vehicle for the truth that you're trying to communicate, but you're able to kind of fly in under the radar, under the defense. All of the defense mechanisms are on hold, and you can have a conversation.
Yeah. There was a fellow teacher that I worked with, and her son, she said, hated spinach, but he ate it every day. And I was like, well, explain to me how that works. And she says, well, I have a smoothie that I make from every day, and he doesn't know, but I slip spinach into it. And
There you go.
and what I thought of is, like, in a way, like, a story is like a way of putting those truths or those propositions in a more palatable way for somebody to digest, something that they can receive in their own way. Yeah,
I see what you did there, Gabe. I see what you did there. You used a story to help us to, that was really good. And that's exactly what we're thinking.
Yeah. And so, like, as a communicator, we have to think about, like, the function, what we want this story to function in our sermon, or when we're talking with somebody. It could just be in a conversation, because, like I mentioned, my grandpa used stories more for breaking down boundary or barriers, like breaking down defenses, and more for, like, humor. And that's very appropriate way to use story at some places too. Sometimes it's to build credibility, but I think other times it's to bring a punch and to make a point. And there's very effective ways to do it. And so, like, sometimes I'm thinking about where is the punch and what's the point I'm trying to make, and how can this story help say that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's when I'm prepping to speak.
Mm-hmm.
I work on stories probably more than anything else. Like, I mean, I have, my points, obviously, I know what I'm going to say, but my stories, I get really precise about the stories, because stories can actually take too long. You can have all these unnecessary details. So I work really hard, and I usually go for a walk because that helps me. I don't know, when I'm moving, to practice. And so I will practice the story that I'm going to tell a bunch of different times, and I'll time myself. I want to get it to like 3.5 minutes if possible. I don't want to take any more time than that. And I'll be really precise about eliminating unnecessary details. But the thing I work hardest on is my opening line and my closing line, because I want those to link up for how I'm actually using the story. Mm-hmm. And so how I enter the story and how I exit are super important. And, when you're on a platform, I've made all the mistakes, Gabe. You're thinking, I want to tell this story, and I'll set up like 3 different sentences to set it up. Well, I was with my son, and actually, we were driving, and but that doesn't matter. It's like, it doesn't, like I'm trying. How do I start the story, right? And so I have to get those ready beforehand, because I want to use every minute wisely, right?
Shannon, I think that's, like, such a good point, because I'll hear a communicator and I'm like, okay, they are more excited about the story than the message behind it or something. Or like, I've had times where for myself, I've included just unnecessary details that really don't contribute. So I want to be efficient with my stories. Yeah. And I think the part you said about what you start with and what you end with, because it's kind of like the Olympics, like when you do the dismount and you finish, I mean, you could have a great story, but if if the dismount, the end is not clear, like why I'm telling this story, people will
Mm-hmm.
be like, why did they? I mean, that was a great story, but I don't know what to do with it. Like you almost need to have
Right.
like a tag that tells them this is where the story was. Like they need to understand that without being too overt about it. Because I
Mm-hmm.
think like what's really good for communicators is when they can use this technique called digression, and they're talking about a point, and as they're telling stuff about the point, all of a sudden they break and they start telling a story, and they don't tell you why they're telling the story.
Okay.
Um, and then at the end of the story, they bring it back to the point that's at hand. And
Hmm.
all of a sudden, it's like you didn't even see it coming, but you realize how this story brought to life the point they were trying to make. And they bookend it with talking about like the point that they were, talking about. Because I think I talked about in the previous podcast how a lot of times how we're taught to communicate is tell people what you're going to tell them, tell it to them, and then tell them what you told them. But that doesn't really allow any transformation. It's really good for information delivery, but like if I really want to bring a punch, I can't tell somebody I'm going to punch them.
Yeah.
I'm not going to actually punch them, but you know what I mean. But I have to bring the punch and not allow them to see it coming in the story, like to have that tension there.
Yeah. No, that's so good. I didn't know there was a term for that, digression, but I've definitely used it,
Yeah,
just for the communicators out there. You don't even have to set up the story. Just go ahead and tell it, right?
yeah,
One of my biggest pet peeves, Gabe, is when people will stand up. I mean, not pet peeve. I can endure with you, but they'll get up to talk and they'll be like, "Well, Mary asked me to speak. I thought about, oh, what am I going to say? And I thought maybe I should talk about this. And then no, not that. Maybe I should talk about this. No. And what I decided is I really want to talk about this." And you're just like, oh my goodness, please don't give me your process. I don't need that. That's not serving me at all. You don't have to apologize for being up there. Speak. We all understand that you're the speaker and you've come with a message. So
yeah,
just get on with it. Right. But same with the stories. Like, there's almost an over setup. And if you'll just go ahead and get started with the story, it actually makes more sense. I love that digression. Let's see if I can come up with an example. I was just actually today thinking about a story that I'd like to use in a message. So let's see if I can do this. Change it's incremental. We don't change all in a moment, right? Galatians 5 says that we're to keep in step with the Spirit. We're to walk by the Spirit. And walking involves a series of step by step by step, really decisions. It's a decision-making process. And so we're walking, like some people think it's walking by the power of the Spirit, but I think it's just walking alongside the Spirit also. I think both are true. The Spirit is empowering you, walking in the right direction, doing the right things. But there's also a sense of being with the Lord, right? As you walk out your Christian life. So we have a new puppy. His name is Moses. And what I've been noticing about this little guy, Moses, is that he likes to sneak off sometimes. He'll be with me. I'm cooking dinner. I'm cleaning the bathroom. I'm here at the computer. He's with me. He's with me. He's with me all day long. And then all of a sudden I notice like, oh my goodness, he's not with me. And there is a problem. And then I go and I look in, some little hallway or end of a closet or something, and I find a little deposit that he has made because he was not with me, right? And so the good life happens when he stays with me, walking with me side by side all the way through our day. If he makes it through a whole day and he's just with me the whole way through, there's nothing to discipline. There's nothing that I need to correct him on. It's those moments that he's not with me, that there needs to be corrective measure. Okay. So I don't know if I told that story
I love that.
perfectly, but see how I hopefully I just modeled that digression. I'm making a point
Yeah,
and then I used a story to flesh that out a little bit.
I really like that because you didn't. It was almost like you so smoothly went into the story that if somebody's not listening carefully, they don't even know when you've switched. Like there's
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
abrupt. Okay, let me tell a story to illustrate what Paul knew.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's just, you're talking about walking in step with the Spirit. And then I think the phrase you used was, what I noticed about the puppy, it was so smooth that I
Mhm.
almost didn't even know when you switched into the story.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really all you need to do. Um, but yes, when I'm saying walk by the Spirit, I'm creating a word picture, and that is very helpful. But what do you like? Let me just throw this is just live. I didn't give you this ahead of time. What do you think telling the story about the dog, how does that serve that part of the message, do you think? Is there a teen you know and love who struggles with the endless pressure of comparison? Maybe she drives herself to exhaustion trying to prove she measures up. Or maybe she shrinks back to the shadows, convinced that she'll never measure up. In my brand new book, Comparison Girl for Teens, co-authored with Lee Nienhuis, we're talking about the new face of this age-old problem, comparison. We've got lots of fun quizzes and stories to keep her engaged, and we've broken up the chapters by topic, talking about things that she's got questions about, comparing beauty, comparing femininity, comparing popularity, and more. But ultimately, our goal is to invite your teen to Jesus's healthier, happier way of living me-free. So come visit comparisongirl.com and get the answers that both she and you need on how to thrive beyond measure in a world that compares.
Well, you take like a very complex idea, like walking with the Spirit, and bring it into a very tangible, real life thing. A part of a story, I think the function is translating a very complex issue into something
Yeah.
that's tangible and real. So if I talk about listening to God, and I'm talking about the Hebrew word Shema, and how we need to listen to God, because in the famous Hebrew prayer, "Hear, O
Mm-hmm.
Israel, the Lord your
Yeah.
God is one," and this idea of listening. But there's a lot of times when things distract us from listening. So when I was a janitor once, there was this one fellow janitor that would talk my ear off. And he would always talk about all the miscellaneous details that nobody cared about the work they were doing. And one time I saw a friend of mine who was at a basketball game. And so I wanted to catch my friend before he left. And all of a sudden, guess who steps in the way? It's this janitor. And he just talks and talks. And I try to sidestep and get around that. And then my friend leaves, and this janitor is still talking to me. And I step away and say, "I can't talk right now. I got to go." And I'm not trying to be mean, but I don't have time to listen at that point. And so I step away. And as soon as I step away, I realize what the guy was saying. He was saying that he just got a call that his wife was in an ambulance going to the ER. And so when I shared that, like, I'm doing like the same thing you were talking about, just this smooth onboard to a story. And I'm trying to do that to illustrate a moment where I didn't listen to someone who was right in front of me.
Mm-hmm.
And how sometimes God could be, if we can do that with people, is it possible we can do that with the Lord and
That's
miss
good.
something that he's saying? Yeah.
And what you did with that story is you made us feel the loss. You made us feel the hurt of that, of not this man not being listened to. And it's something important. And like, in a sense, we're feeling how God feels when we don't listen, because he's saying, "Listen, O Israel, listen, the Lord your God is one." And he wants us to listen to him. And so, yeah, that idea, like, we might not feel that without that story. So that story then serves this idea of listening. I think stories too, as you're putting together a message, stories slow the flow of ideas. That's one of the things that we talk about in Teach Equip. I've heard Lindsay and Kelly say that many times, like they slow, we can only take in so many thoughts per minute. And so a story helps us to just bring the pace in a little bit, extend it. Let's just think about this a little bit longer. It's like, it's like you're pouring water into the plant, and you don't just dump the water all at once. You pour a little bit and let the water soak into the soil, pour a little bit more. And then it doesn't spill over, right? If you just dump the whole watering can into the plant, it's going to spill over. It's not going to sink in. And that's the same with our audience. So stories can help things just sink in. It slows the pace. It gives you another angle to be looking at this truth that we want to hold up and impact our audiences.
I love that idea of slowing down our communication, because I think that we live in a society where efficiency and making everything fast is like urgency is like the priority, but slowing down our communication, I think, is really good, and story does that. I think another one that story does is, you mentioned this in the previous podcast about mobilizing people. One of my favorite phrases or statements is, whoever tells the best story wins. And it's not about competition, but I more mean like what's at stake in our society is who's telling the best story. And I think that it's just really important for Christians to tell the story and tell it well, because there's so many competing narratives in our society right now.
What would be some of those competing narratives, like where the world is telling a story that seems compelling and that we as Christians have the truer, better story?
Yeah. When I worked as a college minister, I would see competing narratives. And, I see these TV shows and movies that young ladies are watching where it shows a narrative of what love is, or songs that are very popular out right now that are talking about what love is. And so, some of them are just, be whoever you feel like. But then there's other narratives of be whoever this person you love wants you to be is the proposition. And then it turns people into just doing whatever will win love or earn it. And when we read the gospel, it shows two different types of love. So like in Ephesians 4, it says, these people gave themselves up to pleasure, to sensuality. And it uses this language of giving themselves up, like trading. But then if you go to the next chapter, chapter 5 of Ephesians, it talks about Jesus who loved us and gave himself up for us. And it gives another message of what love is, because I think that so often right now there's this idea that if you want love, you have to trade yourself, give yourself up for this. And they paint it, very romanticized, that this, if you give yourself up for this person or this thing, that you'll have this great experience and it'll just be everything you want. But then if you look at what Jesus did, it says he gave himself up for us. It was self-sacrifice. It wasn't for his own pleasure. Those are very different narratives. And what we have is a lot of movies and shows that are very eye-focused. And the rhetoric gets changed to my rights. And when that happens, so much I language, it just, it sounds very inspiring, but when the rhetoric becomes so much about yourself, it is a narrative that's different than the gospel.
Yeah, it's so true. I've been watching my kids just navigate dating, and there's the apps now, the dating apps, and there are so many ways that technology has changed the whole landscape of dating. Like, I think even just looking at an app and evaluating a person on a screen, you evaluate, your whole sense of evaluating them is different. I mean, you're like zooming in, looking at the pictures, like look in a way that you wouldn't if you met them, right? If you were talking to them, you wouldn't be like, let me see, are your eyes exactly the same, size? Are they, I don't know. I think there's a whole different way that we're approaching each other in relationships that's only being reinforced by the movies that we watch and the shows, whatever songs we listen to.
I think that word evaluation is so key, because that is what happens is dating becomes about evaluation instead of seeing the person as a gift from God.
Yes.
Because if you go into marriage with that same lens of constantly evaluating somebody, it's constantly like a report card in their face, as opposed to seeing the person as a gift, is way different.
And so, you approach dating differently. If you're looking at marriage as a gift that God would potentially give me. And so I'm going to be looking at this opportunity to get to know someone, to see if this is a gift that God has for the both of us.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so good. I feel like we could do another whole episode on dating, right? And you probably have a lot of experience talking with different young adults about dating. But any last thoughts that you might share with us, Gabe, on using story as communicators, especially sharing truth from the Bible or in conversation with others?
Yeah, I think don't be afraid to just start the story. Like we said earlier, recognize what is the function of the story I'm telling, and what are the details that are most necessary. I think just one last thing I'd say is like practice telling story, like use it in conversation, and it helps you be able to be more prepared to use it. Like if you're telling your testimony or an illustration while preaching. And then I think we just need people that understand the power of story, that are architects. Like my undergrad was creative writing, and I think that isn't a deterrent to preaching. I think that creative writing, we need people that are writers and understand and appreciate story, because it is what will shape the imaginations of the next generation. So
it's so true. Yeah, it's so true. Yeah. I love what you said there. I do that intuitively, like what you just said. Like I pay attention to if there's something that has happened and I tell like more than one person this thing that happened, I'm like, oh, that's probably going to be a good illustration at some point, because it's obviously something that I think people might want to hear. It's, you're for a story, you're looking for something that's out of the ordinary, that catches attention. It's ironic. It's funny. There's something about it that makes a story, right?
Yeah, that's worth telling. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a story that's worth telling. And so then you're looking for, okay, how can I weave this, how do people respond to it when I interject it in conversation? What's their reaction? Do they understand it the same way that I'm intending, or do I need to change the way that I tell it? But yeah, just trying it out on different people before you might in a larger audience setting. But also, I think just looking for those opportunities in the Bible to what are the stories in the Bible that have most captured my attention, captured my heart, and how can I retell those stories to myself and to other people? Well, thank you so much for both of these conversations, Gabe. It's been such a pleasure to have you talking about story in the Bible and communication. So such a joy.
Thank you, Shannon. Thanks for the opportunity.
Let me just remind you that each story of the Bible is true. Collectively, these stories help us to know God and understand this true story that we are all part of. If you want to live like the true story is the true story, I've designed my false narrative watch list to help you identify and reject the world's lies, which are corrected by the truth of God's Word. This is a free download. There's a link in the show notes. It's going to help you take what we've discussed here on the podcast and live like it's true. We've also provided links for you to easily find our guests who have been here on the show. And I hope you'll also check out some of the resources that we've mentioned here in conversation. The links for all of those things are there for you in the show notes. Live Like It's True is part of the Resound Media Network. For more gospel-centered resources, go to resoundmedia.cc. Thanks to my son, Cade Popkin, for providing all of our music, and to my assistant, Katie Veenstra, who helps produce the show. And thanks to you for tuning in and for sharing this podcast with others. And now it's time to go live like it's true.